This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You will get exclusive subscriber-only content. For example, most recently, an interview with Itai Atel, professor of economics at Tel Aviv University, who discusses his new study into the radically new patterns of emigration of Israelis out of Israel in the last few years. Or an interview with Sina Azodi, professor of Middle East politics at George Washington University, about his book, Iran and the Bomb. Just go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and look for the big button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a historian and Israel Studies scholar, a fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston. He has a new book out entitled Shifting Solidarities, the South African Anti-Apartheid Movement's Perception of Zionism. It has just been published by University of Virginia Press. It is an overview of a convoluted relationship spanning several decades, from the 1940s until more or less today. Dr. Asher Lubotzky, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, Gilad. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Sure. So one of those well-known historical coincidences is that apartheid South Africa and the State of Israel came into this world in the same year, 1948. Apartheid, which was, as we all know, a system that was designed to privilege white South Africans, met with resistance from a very early stage. So when you're talking about an anti-apartheid movement, it's really a hodgepodge of many organizations and ideological movements. So can you start by mapping them out for us? Who were the people and groups that made up the anti-apartheid movement, as you see it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. It was a bunch of very different movements, sometimes ideologically very distinct. And so of course it also evolved through the years. They emerged, they splintered, and you see, for example, that that's what scholars do. They divide them into two big kind of umbrella groups that were not anything official, but this helps us kind of understand the anti-apartheid movement. The first part is a more kind of moderate one called the liberal with capital with liberal, and the other one is the radical movements. The radical movements were much more supportive of breaking the system, changing the system altogether as quickly as possible, usually, while the liberal opposition, anti-apartheid opposition, was more into gradualist approach of changing the system through reforms and so on. In my book specifically, I focus on the radical anti-apartheid movement, which is also a very diverse concept, actually. And within the radical movement, and again, it expanded through the years because apartheid has become, more and more controversial within South Africa. It always been, but it became more and more, more enemies of apartheid through the years, so it expanded through the years. But at the beginning, for example, as you mentioned, right, 1948, a very important year for both places, Israel and South Africa, you had a bunch of movements that were, again, pretty different and wanted a very radical shift. One of them was the Communist Party of South Africa. The Communist Party, by the way, wasn't the only Marxist group in South Africa that wanted such a revolutionary shift. There were also Trotskyists, and Trotskyist organization, as we know, as anyone who dealt with far-left groups knows, that they splinter, and there's a bunch of those. Okay, it's not
there's
only just
more organizations than members.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes, exactly. So you have this kind of Marxist, okay, which again, the communists and the Trotskyists hated each other, but we kind of label them as Marxist. If we look into it was a very small group, but if we look into like kind of a Jewish perspective, there was kind of a Bundist kind of, strand to it. So that was kind of the more leftist Marxist. But you also had African nationalists, which was actually much more numerous in terms of supporters.
Who weren't necessarily Marxist.
Who at that point were not Marxist at all even, right? They started towards the end of the 40s and definitely throughout the 50s to collaborate and even merge with mostly the communists in South Africa. But the old guard of the ANC, right? This is the movement we're talking about, the main movement, the African National Congress, right?
Later Mandela's party.
Right, later Mandela's party. So before Mandela became kind of the leader, it was a pretty conservative, pretty religious, like in terms of like their worldviews. It wasn't very leftist in terms of, Marxism or economy and stuff like that. And but they were, of course, they wanted equal rights. And they didn't like the white supremacist system. So it was a pretty big movement. So you had the ANC. Later, they also split because the ANC, as I said, right, they got closer to the communists. And by the end of the 50s, many African nationalists did not like it. They thought the communism itself is kind of a white supremacist, the Soviet Union. It's kind of a global north thing, right? It's not their authentic thing. So they split and they established a new group called the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress. So, and they were more national, they were very radical. They were actually more militant than the ANC, but they were at least at the beginning, they were anti-communist. Later, they got support by China. China and the Soviet Union in the 60s, they were not best friends at all, to say the least. But so you have a bunch of, and this is just the main one. So you have the PAC, the African Nationalists, the Communists, the ANC, that is kind of something merging kind of African nationalism is kind of Marxism, and you have far left movements, Trotskyist, Bundist, and so on. Later, this is very actually interesting, later the people that we used to call liberals, right, also at some point, because the apartheid government became more and more oppressive and repressive, they started also to take arms. Some of them, not most of them, but some of them. So you had actually radicals who define themselves as liberal. And actually, there was a liberal underground that was a terrorist organization, So, that's very interesting. But that came a bit later, like.
Yeah, you didn't have to wait till 21st century America to have a liberal underground, an armed liberal underground. Anyway, did they expend any thought at all to Israel, Palestine, the Middle East? I mean, was that on their radar in any way? And if so, why?
So it was to a large extent. It wasn't the main issue, of course, but there were a few reasons why they even noticed it, right? I'm talking about 47, 48, 49 at the beginning. So first you had a very large prominence of Jewish activists within these movements, especially the communists. Not only also the Trotskyists a little bit, but especially the communists. And the Jewish activists, and remember, that was fresh after the Holocaust, right? The Jewish activists, as many other communists worldwide, and the Soviet Union itself, right, 48, 49, were supportive of the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. Back then, of course, it was like what we call now the two-state solution, right? But the partition plan, exactly. Yeah. But they, in general, they were supportive of it, both humanitarianly because of the Holocaust, okay, and also because the Soviet Union said to all the communists worldwide, right? They told them, they got a memo, right? You need to support Israel right now because the Soviet Union, right? Just a reminder, right? They sent through Czechoslovakia a lot of arms to Israel. Some people say that Israel would not even would have not survived this war without the Soviet help. So there was this kind of communist stance to support Israel, but it was really, and this is what I did in my book, actually, I showed that it wasn't only kind of a direction from above, right, the memo, but it was also there was an authentic kind of feeling that they said, yeah, I mean, of course, like there was an Holocaust, there's all the, the displaced persons, right, the DPs, the DP camps, right, they knew about this in the West, and by the way, they always did it in a communist way. They blame the West, they blame the United States, they are the supporters of fascism, of anti-Semitism, of Nazism, Nazism. And they are the ones who keep Jews as permanent refugees in the DP camps, right? Because in the East, you didn't have DP camps. Why? It's a different topic, but like you had it mostly in the West, right? In Germany, in Italy, in France. And they said, okay, this is a huge problem. And those refugees, some of them went and volunteered at those camps, the DP camps in Europe.
Some of the South African communists.
Yes, Jewish usually. And they saw it and they were like, okay, Israel is a good solution for that. They also saw, they write it sometimes, that they saw that the displaced persons, they wanted to go to Israel, right? So they saw this kind of Zionist sentiment there. So you had those kind of Jewish communists that were very prominent in the movement. Besides this, you had, of course, non-Jewish communists that, they got the memo from the Soviet Union and they supported Israel. But yeah, like Israel, I remind you, right, in 48, 49, Israel was considered to be a kind of a socialist force in the region. It was led by mostly socialists, right? Back then, at least, it was, it wasn't really clear if they're going to go to like become more pro-American, as obviously pretty soon after they became.
So they were very much against the British Empire, which was obviously a communist cause at the time.
Exactly, and also remember that the people they fought against, like the movements or the countries they fought against, were British allies. Transjordan, right? That was like the closest ally of Great Britain in the region. Egypt was also back then a conservative monarchy. Those are not progressive or like pro-communist players. So it was if I were communist back then, right, I would maybe bet on the Jews would be more likely to become kind of closer to me. So that was the communists. We have other movements, right? And you had the African nationalists. African nationalists, a lot of them, as I said, they grew up, they were educated, right? So they grew up in missionary schools. And they were religious, or to some extent, it was maybe not the central thing. Christian, of course, yes. A lot of them Protestant, not only, but a lot of them Protestant Christian. And at least they grew up on the Bible, or they knew the Bible, and they understood in general. First, they understood that the idea that Jews are indigenous to, this piece of land, right? So it was easy for them to kind of absorb. It wasn't like kind of, settler colonial, that later developed. Second, they saw the Jews, they also as African nationalists. Remember, there was something like that called Black Zionism, African Zionism, right? All these kind of movements, at some point, Marcus Garvey, for example, right? They were very influenced by Zionism, early Zionism, right? So they saw Zionism as a national liberation movement. And if you read the book, you see that the words were very, very strong there. Okay, they weren't cautious what they said. I have the Communist Daily saying like, their op-ed was. The editorial was "Long live Israel." The few days after Israel was, after Ben Gurion, right, declared the state of Israel, it was like "Long live Israel," big letters. So you had this, and you had the stuff in the ANC kind of like newspapers that saying the Arab imperialism should go, the long live Jewish, all this kind of stuff. That was very ideological.
Sure, it come, it's gone a long way until today, where Israel and Zionism are associated with apartheid so closely, and of course the South African government, the heirs of the ANC themselves, who are now in power, are leading the charge against Israel and Zionism. And I wonder, was there anyone drawing parallels between Zionism and apartheid? Not just a coincidence, but actually they said, okay, there's something to it.
Right, so this is exactly what my book is trying to do also, right, is to see when did they start kind of saying, okay, there are some parallels. So really early on, you saw that it was mostly Trotskyists, okay, and I mean, you need to give it to them, right? I don't know, whatever your opinion is, right, or about, about the comparison, right? The Trotskyists were the first ones to promote it. In the end, they were the successful one because, now today in many circles, it's pretty prevalent, right? So they were the kind of the first one to kind of put Zionism in this context of 48, 49, right? In this kind of like more imperialist kind of camp. but also kind of use words that drew parallels to the specific experience of South Africa. It wasn't like a clear comparison, analogy as we have today, but it was, you could see that. So not only the Trotskyists, by the way, also, by the way, right, South Africa is a pretty large, relatively Muslim community. And you saw that, for example, while, the communist organs and the ANC were all pretty much pro-Israel, you saw letters to the editor, and in those letters you read the names, right? And some of those letters said, "Look, the Zionists, whatever, they are the bad actors here." And you see, usually the people signed it. It was a Muslim name, so now they were more way more exposed to the more Arab or Muslim narratives about this, right? So, but they kind of promoted these ideas. For example, one thing that is very South African specific is minority versus majority, right? Because in South Africa it was a minority rule, right? This is what people said, that apartheid is not only wrong because it's racist and it's just not fair democratically, because you have a minority that takes all the privileges and all the rights, and the majority that is lack of them. So, so one of the themes that I saw pretty early on, that it's like they kind of compare the Jews, Zionists, right, Israelis, to this kind of minority in the region, right? Among they didn't look usually. Also, actually, in 48, it was true also between the river and the sea, right? Definitely, but also in the region in general, you see those are the minority, and they are trying to have a state against the majority's will. Okay, so it's not exactly like an analogy, direct analogy, because they didn't say they are apartheid supporters or something like that, but they did say kind of like use those terms of minority and majority. They use the terms of settlers that they saw. Again, it was really at emergence, but you saw it coming. Usually, they didn't accuse them of the Jews, the Zionists, right, of racism or something like that yet. Of course, it will come later. But you started to see this kind of really embryonic analogy coming together early 50s. Maybe even very, very, in a very small manner in the late 40s.
The thing that is really, your book is very interesting is that it really traces the ups and downs of all this, that it's not a progressive narrative in any way, that there's it is very convoluted and meandering. And there are many sort of like historical turning points. One of them is, as you said, the support of the Soviet Union for Israel early on. And then there's the Sinai campaign in which Israel collaborated with Britain and France in what was seen as perhaps the utmost expression of imperialist instincts. And then another thing that I wasn't aware of, that actually it made sense that as part of Israel's efforts to build ties with African countries in the early 1960s, as the decolonization of Africa was underway, they turned against it to an extent. The South African government, I mean, was a byproduct of this relationship with Black Africa. So all these sort of turning points have dictated the discourse that you're analyzing in your book. And I wonder, to what extent is it really just a mirror reflection of Israel's relationship with apartheid South Africa that leads you to analyze all of it as just a reaction to it?
So it's a reflection of a few things, right? It's a result of a few things. The first thing is that definitely, as we see in relationships everywhere, right? If you are my enemy's enemy, I tend to get close to you and think highly of you, right? If you are a friend of my enemy, I tend to hate you as well, right? So you do see that pattern there, definitely, and I would think that at least in the tone of how they spoke about Israel, when Israel was really out and about with the apartheid regime, which started to be, they noticed this already in the late 60s, but that really became clear in the 70s. Then Israel became really an evil state, really like kind of this an axis with apartheid, and they took out back then like countries like Chile, like or like whatever Taiwan, all this kind of the bad guys.
The axis of evil.
They have the axis of evil of the other side, right? So, so that was in the 70s when it was the relations were very clearly, Israel was very clearly working with the apartheid regime with South Africa of the time. But in the 50s and 60s, it was a bit more kind of, I think, complex, because in the 50s you saw those ideas of Israel as this kind of hope, human rights, anti-fascism. Anti-fascism was really important in South Africa because the apartheid supporters, the National Party, the Afrikaners were big supporters, by the way, of Nazism, and there were a lot of Jews relatively in South Africa, especially in the left. So they were very aware of the idea of fascism. So Israel was seen as kind of an anti-fascist thing, and therefore anti-racist, and then like somebody who should be our friend. They were genuinely impressed by some of Israel's achievements, development, economy, the socialist kind of style, social democrat maybe kind of style of government. So they looked at Israel, they obviously looked at the conflict to some extent, but they also, in the end, it was like, who's my friend and who's my enemy? So in the 50s, Israel actually had a rapprochement, right, with Pretoria, of the apartheid regime. Actually, the Prime Minister of South Africa, Malan, like the architect of apartheid, came to Israel. Sharet, Israeli foreign minister, went to South Africa. Israel really tried to...
Well, wasn't Milan the first foreign head of state to visit the sovereign state of Israel?
Yes, I believe so. He was. It was not an official visit. Israel really worked hard so it will not be labeled as an official visit. It was kind of like a religious kind of trip to the Holy Land. It was very religious.
Pilgrimage. Yeah.
Pilgrimage, exactly. Kind of Protestant pastor himself, coming from this kind of theological background. But he met Ben Gurion. There's a photo, right? A very kind of famous photo. But still, they didn't, although it happened, right? Despite all of this, the anti-apartheid movement became more suspicious towards Israel. They started criticizing maybe Ben Gurion himself or the Israeli government, right? But they were not hostile towards the idea of Israel, towards the idea of Zionism as much. I mean, of course, they would never say, I'm pro-Zionist, right? But they would you saw it was really much more nuanced, maybe, a kind of cautious kind of approach, because they always kind of believed that Israel had this kind of an idea that appealed to them. And also they saw elements within the Israeli society as potential allies of their struggle.
Elements such as who?
So, for example, the party of Mapam, right, was like mentioned.
Right? The far left Israeli.
The far left. I don't know if Mapam is such a far left in today's kind of thing.
No, not in today's, but back then.
Right, in the kind of left of the center left that was Mapai, right? They saw the things like Mapam. They, in general, they saw that Israel has a strong union, like the Istadrut, and like the workers are coming out. So leftists appreciated that. But they really, as you mentioned the Suez Crisis, the Sinai campaign, this was really the low of Israel's, and even then you saw discussions about, why Israel did that. That was not really Israel's fault. It was more the imperialists that made Israel do that. It was more like, Nasser. Nasser also, they have very complex relations with Nasser, right? Nasser wasn't clear to be on their side all the time, on the side of the global left all the time. So you see that even around the Suez Crisis, they were much more anti-Israel than before, but they were not so much as we saw in the 70s and on. The 60s was the best time. And then what really hurt them, I think, after 67. So a lot of people say it's because 67, the occupation, it was not so much that. It was also that, but it was not so much that then, rather than they saw Israel really removing or like really neglecting, putting down all the ideas of supporting anti-apartheid or like kind of opposing apartheid or kind of helping them or kind of like being restricted with the relationship with Pretoria, with the apartheid regime. They saw that like Israel is like just like, okay, we don't care about that anymore. Pretty much the Israel government at least, right? We don't care about this anymore. And that really hurt them. And that was more than all the feeling of disappointment.
But what was that?
Why did Israel do that? Or Israel is, okay, so also kind of complex. First, as Israel is, we know, the military, and especially after 1967, the military took the upper end in foreign policy also. And in general, you know, strategy and like national security, but also foreign policy. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all this kind of more diplomatic, like, you know, keep relations also with, you know, kind of complex relations with people, with countries or movements that may criticize you, right? All of this kind of went down, and all these very security-focused elements became at the helm, right? Became most prominent, and you saw that Israel was like, okay, how do I rebuild my army? Who's in the world can help me militarily and security-wise, right? It really was especially very important after the Yom Kippur War of 1973. But you saw it also before that, right? It was becoming like Israel started to think in a kind of very militarized ways about the world. And South Africa, the regime in South Africa actually offered a lot. It could offer a lot to Israel in terms of both natural resources and also investments. And at the same time, South Africa had become more and more isolated. So South Africans themselves, they had the money, they had the resources, but they had no one, less and less people to like collaborate with, right, to work with. And they like some stuff in Israel, especially the Israeli, you know, development of weapons and stuff like this. And they saw a very good opportunity to collaborate. So Israel had a lot to gain from white South Africa. Resources, funding, a lot of investment. That was like the early 80s, I think, were they like the top of that. Like Israel, if I remember correctly, it was like 40% of Israeli arms sales went to South Africa. So there was a lot to gain in terms of both money and also development, research and development of weapons. Second, and this is important, and this is why it's so complex, the Jews in South Africa, you know, about 120,000 people, they were white. Right? They were considered white in South Africa. It was very rigid, right? You couldn't like just like change your race or gender or whatever. You're white if you're white, and they were considered white. And they, you know, we mentioned the leftist ones, right? But leftist ones, you know, you had a few hundreds of them, maybe a few thousand, you know, 1,000, 2,000. Most of the others were living within white South Africa, and you know, maybe they didn't really like the style of apartheid, or you know, but in the end they were benefiting from that. And if you supported anti-apartheid measurements, Israel, by the way, was the first Western country to vote for sanctions against South Africa, the UN. Okay, so Israel actually was at the forefront.
I'm talking
in the early 60s, exactly, before 67. But okay, so they did all this anti-apartheid thing, and then South African Jews came, you know, the community, right? The leaders of the community came to Israel and was like, guys, you are hurting us too. Both ways. First, sanctions against South Africa means sanctions against us too. Second, the white non-Jews, the Afrikaner nationalists, they blame us, right? We all know that like it's very easy for many people to blame the Jews somewhere else for what Israel is doing, right?
Especially when you're a white supremacist fascist.
Right, exactly, right? It's like, of course, it's like you don't need more explanations, right? So it's like they're blaming us. Now they're gonna, you know, start attacking us. So like, stop it. So there was a lot of pressure. And now it's only, maybe you can say, oh, it's only 120,000 people. But they were very, very important in the development of Israel, actually. They were number one per capita donors to all this kind of Zionist, you know, fundraising causes. So it's a very, very Zionistic community. Traditionally, by the way, this is just an anecdote, the first nationwide South African Jewish organization was the Zionist Federation. So, right, in America, it's really maybe one of the last ones.
Say no more.
Right, yeah. Right. So it was very, very, very close to Israel, invested a lot. You have cities in Israel, Savion, Ashkelon, that you still see Afidar, right? South African kind of fingerprints. And they also said, okay, Israel's just stop it. So you had the Jewish South African pressure to stop being anti-apartheid. There was a lot of benefits that came with it. And there was also this kind of arrogance, right? After the 6 Day War, it was like, we won, the story, right? We got it. We don't really need to have such a complex relationship and, keep relations with also the Soviet Union and also others, and Africa is maybe not so important because Israel really invested in African things, but it's not. We won all our wars, we got all our the territory, and why should we keep investing on all those kind of back then looked like fringe movements, right? That may hurt us. And it just dwindled down. At the same time, the anti-apartheid struggle itself became more violent. So it was kind of more polarizing, like black or white kind of thing. Like you had to choose if you are investing in a violent resistance against the South African regime. This is something that Israel in the early 60s did not kind of.
Yeah, because global terrorism became a thing only in the 70s, right? Also then there were parallels drawn between the methods of the ANC and the PLO.
Right. And the ANC itself started getting much more support from the PLO and from sponsors of the PLO, like Egypt and other radical, back then was radical countries.
But I wonder, before that 1967 turn, during that ambivalent period that Israel was both supportive of apartheid and anti-apartheid, essentially. Did official Israel make any effort to reach out to the anti-apartheid movement?
Yes. Okay, that's what I found out in my book. That's a big chapter in my book. You talk about before 67, right?
Yeah.
Yes, so definitely. Here again, it was a cautious policy because they didn't want to go all the way into let's say quote unquote terrorist kind of very violent options that started to form after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 in South Africa. So Israel did want to support the anti-apartheid cause, but wanted to do it as legitimately as possible, without getting too into too dirty things. Until 1963. In 1963, Israel understood that the anti-apartheid struggle takes more a kind of, let's say, quote-unquote, violent or armed, turn. And Israel, if it wants to keep being anti-apartheid, needs to have connection with the armed groups. And they did. So Israel did reach out. And more than that, they reached out to Israel. But your question was about Israel reaching out to them. So yes, Israel had very broad presence in Africa in the 60s. More than now, okay? Dozens of, I think, 20-something embassies. Okay, it was very easy relatively to approach Israelis in Africa at the time, especially in cities like Dar es Salaam, today Tanzania, right? Tanganyika at some point until in the early 60s. So Dar es Salaam became a hub for Israeli relations with anti-colonialists, not only anti-apartheid, but also movements in Mozambique and Angola and today Zimbabwe, back then Rhodesia. So there were a lot of contacts in Dar es Salaam. There were contacts in Zambia when Zambia got independence. There were contacts in Kinshasa, in Accra, in Ghana. Okay, so those all those contacts. And Israel, again, as we kind of implied before, right? Israel saw the anti-apartheid cause not so much from a moral perspective. There was this talk about morality, but it was not so much moral. It was more to show the African allies that we are here with you. We are paying our dues in solidarity, and we're supporting anti-apartheid because it's really important to you, because we want you to support us at the UN, right, and other things. So, Israel did feel a need to support the anti-apartheid movement to some extent that the Africans will notice that, right? So Israel first the ANC, right, the Mandela's party, approach Israel. Oliver Tambo approached Israel, but that was before 1963. Israel was not really ready for relations. So they talked a lot. Oliver Tambo was at the Israeli ambassador's house in residence in Dar es Salaam a few times. In 1963, when Israel said, okay, we are willing, we put some budget aside, we are willing to give you some, the ANC was already too deeply with the Soviet Union and Egypt, and they didn't really want this. But the other organizations that we mentioned in the beginning, the PAC, the Pan-Africanists, the African nationalists, allegedly anti-Soviet, right? They definitely needed sponsors. Okay, so in this 63, 64, they started having relations with China. China became their major supporter, but it wasn't enough at the time, and they needed more countries or organizations to support them, and they approached Israel. They approached Israel, and Israel first hesitated. The PAC had this kind of more terrorist, more violent kind of like aura than the ANC. But in the end, Israel started supporting the PAC and started paying, moving funds, right? Transferring funds and funding them from about 63, 64 to until the PAC didn't want money anymore, which was last time they paid them was the 1970.
And the reason they did that without hesitation is because before 1967, the relationship with Pretoria was not that important.
That was the low time of relationship with Pretoria. Definitely, so Israel voted for sanctions against South Africa in 1961. Okay, Israel actually publicized, it wasn't really much behind this, but it publicized an arms embargo against South Africa, okay? Israel, if we remember what the arms that Israel produced at the time was Uzis, mostly the Uzi submachine gun, which was actually highly esteemed, but it wasn't like today, right? So Israel banned actually selling Uzis to South Africa in 1959, if I remember correctly, but they publicized it in 1961 as part of this kind of like, look, we are very anti-apartheid. So at some point in those years, I think 1963, they called back their ambassador to South Africa, and there was only charge d'affaires, right? Like a lower delegation, the Israel delegation. They tried never to break ties with South Africa, but this early 60s was the law. Israel and South Africa were in bad terms. South African regime complained about Israel, attacked Israel. By the way, used the apartheid analogy a lot. Things that we still hear a lot today on social media, for example. The apartheid head of state, Hendrik Verwoerd, said in 1960-61, they said, why are you attacking us? Israel, why are you attacking us? You are hypocrites. You are apartheid yourself, right? And he actually, here was the guy promoting this kind of analogy in the most sophisticated way until that moment, I think, in the world, right? Much more than the anti-apartheid movement, even more than, I think, that's what the Soviet used to say at the time. So maybe it's him and like maybe some, Arab delegates at the UN, but that was kind of the thing, right? So Israel and South Africa had bad relations in the 60s. Israel was then, back then, it was still like the relations with France, the relations with the United States started growing. So they didn't feel the need. And also there was a very strong foreign ministry in Israel. In general, Golda Meir was the foreign minister. Than Abba Evan, but
strong in the sense that they were calling the shots. So,
yeah, they were more. They were salient within the decision-making process,
as opposed to the military post 1967.
Exactly,
as you say. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, this, at least in terms of South Africa, this is what I clearly noticed. Like the foreign ministry led all this African policy in general. By the way, still today, the Africa policy in Israel, it's very rare because Israel is still today, the military apparatus and the security apparatus is very prominent, central. But when it comes to Africa, you see that actually there it's where the foreign ministry is actually a bit more, But
if we fast forward to more recent decades. So as you said, there was this honeymoon period between Israel and South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. And then, of course, the reaction of the anti-apartheid movement, also against the backdrop of apartheid becoming more repressive and more violent. Obviously, the reaction of the anti-apartheid movement to Israel was much more negative. But then, and of course, we have the last few years where the relationship between Israel and ANC ruled South Africa is perhaps at the lowest ebb it's ever been. But there was some sort, also in the period where apartheid was being dismantled and democracy was being restored and Mandela was the head of state, there was also this sort of like an ambivalent relationship between Israel and the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement. Please unpack this for us.
Right, definitely, yes. Okay, so that was, of course, part of the much larger context of the 90s, of the end of the Cold War, of this kind of reconciliation spirit over the war, the end of the apartheid, the reunification of Germany, and in Israel, Palestine, right? The Oslo Accords, right? The Accords of Jordan. And that was there was the end of history kind of feeling in the air, right? That it's okay, all those kind of conflicts, that was part of the past. Now we are heading into a new era. And South Africa, the ANC was elected 1994, Mandela as president, and they looked back and they and saw the situation as it was right during the Rabin government and the Oslo Accords, and they were like, okay, Israel is going through a process that we just went through. Okay, it's the kind of the same thing. So it's like, just like we could reconcile with our white oppressors, right, the National Party, and they actually they're still participating in democracy and so on. So is Israel, of course, not, exactly, right, because two-state solution is not the solution for South Africa that they chose. But still, we can work with our former ex-enemies. Let's put the past, aside, and let's move on. Of course, they were still more, if you need to grade it, kind of more always tilted to more pro-Palestine and pro-Israel, even in the mid-90s. But they were much more open to relations with Israel, especially under the labor right governments, the more left-wing governments that still were in the 90s in Israel. And they were actually, for me as an historian, actually, that was very interesting, because this is when they started to open up about the relations that they used to have, or what they used to think about Israel. By the way, it was a very short period, because, once Second Intifada and Netanyahu, whatever, they shut down again. But now you heard people, including ones that are very, very anti-Israel right now, that were like, yeah, I actually, they got a lot of interviews, because they thought it's over, the anti-apartheid struggle is over, right? Now it's time to legacy.
The end of history.
The end of history. Now it's time for legacy building, right? So there were interviews and all this stuff. And then in the 90s, you saw that the way they talked about historical Israel, like it's the Israel of the 50s, 40s, was much more positive. It's like, and people were like, oh, yeah, I did support Israel in the 1948. And yeah, we saw whatever 6-Day War, actually, that was pretty impressive what they did. Like things that they wouldn't say in the 70s, 80s when they were, or now, right? They did say it in the 90s, and it was because a lot of autobiographies and interviews were taken then. That was great for me as an historian, because then I saw all these kind of things that they wouldn't admit otherwise. And one of the things that I did in my introduction is to show how people really change their own memories of themselves according to what is, the trend, so to speak, right, of the way Israel is perceived, right? And at some points it was much more warm, and then it was like later, right, it was like totally different, right? So that was very interesting, and so you had some kind of like this. Yeah,
the interesting thing about your book, I think, is that it really, on the one hand, it goes down the beaten path of, the way Israel was perceived along the years, especially by the progressive left, like saying, okay, it started off as this leftist, anti-colonialist paradise, and then it sort of was backsliding towards its own sort of imperialism after 1967, after an ambivalent period in which it flirted with the non-aligned movement and other African and third world, so-called third world countries. But at the same time, there's always these very special particularities of South Africa because of that very unique system that was in place. And also, you mentioned it, if you want to expand on that a little further, I would be very glad, because of the makeup of the white South African population, including the big and fairly influential Jewish community.
Right. Definitely. And for Israel, when people are kind of trying to evaluate and understand Israel from afar, tends to, go to very broad thinking of like Israel is trying to shape something or do something very like kind of global level. But, and for Israel, it's much easier to understand that Israel's policies foreign policies are pretty narrow in terms of their goals. Their goals is first secure whatever, either funding or resources or for arms, okay, for security related to survive, so to speak, right? And the other is to, and it's connected to this in a way, right, to have relations with Jewish communities. not only because of this kind of like pan-Jewish kind of ideas, but also because Jewish communities tend to be more supportive of Israel, and that can serve other realistic goals, right? So for Israel, South Africa was, it was always part of Africa, obviously, and all this kind of decolonial struggle in Africa, and but it was also, especially back then, the place, a center of a very important Jewish communities that they needed to keep relations with. They wanted to, one of the earliest El Al, lines was to Johannesburg, right? It's not trivial, right? Destination, right, to have from Israel, and it was because of the Jewish. Again, it's because of the Jewish community there. And Israel did, you see, I read, a lot of government cabinet protocols and stuff like that. You saw that the Jewish element of our, we do what we do, but we still keep the Jews safe, was pretty important. Levi Eshkol at some point was like, let's stop with all this anti-apartheid thing, because we'll have to escape, to help the Jews escape. We'll have to have flights to Johannesburg to let the Jews, because they're going to be massacred there.
That's in the early 60s.
In the 60s, right? This is like early mid 60s kind of like feelings that like, okay, what we do actually puts in huge danger the Jewish community there. So this was the Jewish element of the white society. But as I said before, right, the Jews still were white, right? So you couldn't be really anti-South African white if the most important thing for you was Jewish safety, right? Now Jews themselves, this is another topic, but it's like South African Jews, right? What did they think? They maybe were afraid, right, worried of the Afrikaner nationalists, partially anti-Semitic, right, elements of apartheid. But they were also pretty concerned, especially as the 60s moved forward, and you saw that it was armed resistance against whites in general. They were also pretty afraid from movements like the PAC, the same movements that Israel was supporting for a few years. So,
because they were white.
Because they were white, and because also the PAC, or most, the rank and file of the PAC at least, did not make the differentiation. And you see it still in Africa. This is something that people, many cases when they talk about anti-Semitism in Africa, and people kind of say, a lot of Africans say that, they're white. They're just white. We don't care what kind of religious you have. You're just white for us, it's very prevalent. If it's true or not, I don't know, probably more complex, but it's a prevalent kind of feeling. By the way, I saw that the PAC, when they talked with Israel, actually their head, like their leaders, they made a differentiation between Jews and non-Jews whites. And it was a very interesting, that's something I want to really emphasize, an anecdote. They appealed for money. That I kind of tried to fundraise from Israel. And they said, look, you give us the money, that's an investment, right? It's in my own words, but this is pretty much what they said. This is an investment for you. Why? Because after we're going to kick the apartheid regime out and the white people, we're going to protect the Jews. Okay? Because, by the way, apartheid, they are pro-Nazi. They told them they are pro-Nazi, they're going to come for the Jews next. But us is resisting against this is also preventing the second Holocaust or something like this. And also, we're going to protect the Jews. Let's make a deal, okay? You help us get the apartheid and we'll protect the Jews. So their leaders, actually, some of them, especially Sobukwe, the leader of the PAC, somebody who could have now been remembered like a Mandela, but he died too early. Very, very impressive person, was very well read. Very well read in Israel in Jewish history. And actually, we have his letters from prison that he read. At some point, he even said, if I could choose, like if I, what to be, or like if I were not African or something like this, I would choose to be Jew. Okay, so that was impressive. That was before 67 or around 67. So you had these kind of feelings. And for Israel, South African Jewry was the most important thing. You had, as you said, right, it was a diverse population, the white South African Jew. You had Afrikaners, and you had the English-speaking kind of bunch. Of course, for Israel, it was a bit easier maybe to communicate with the English, at least for South African Jews for sure, but for Israel is also to kind of have relations with white South Africans who are English speakers. Although the Afrikaners at some point became closer to this kind of Christian Zionist things that we know today, or for a few decades, of course, from the United States. They didn't really start like this theologically, but they came to kind of embrace it at some point, especially as Israel got closer to them, right? You need to kind of justify this. So, that was interesting.
Yeah, wow. So many little twists and turns in that story. Asher Lubotzky, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gilad, for having me here.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request to you, our listeners, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to please ask you to write us a review, good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and on Blue Sky as well. And most important, join us again next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.